So I don't
Yeah.
even know what to say. I just like, I think this is kind of a topic. Like you said, David, it folds a lot in.
Yeah, it does. It's really interesting. So like observing the change in how you present and Mhm.
Yeah, and
So,
how
Yeah.
audience responsiveness, audience, maybe more, I don't want to say extreme, but say like views that are sharper, kind of coming in, and then deciding as you as the person, I don't want to say publisher, whatever, right? Like what is true for me? Like, what am I trying to do here? And like sticking to that regardless of, while staying open to input, like, okay, maybe I didn't consider such and such before. I'm open to taking that in.
having a mission, having a purpose. And I always throw those out there for my readers, saying like, here's my mission, here's my purpose. This is what I'm here for. I'm really clear about that. And so audience capture I try to use that to keep to let people know what I'm here for, but it doesn't always work for some reason, because people have assumptions that they embed into it, and they're not the same assumptions that I may have. And those get teased out with time.
People think that people project part of themselves onto you and hope that you're that person, don't they? And then you will always end up disappointing people who've unfortunately done too much of that.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah, it's a really great point and a great way to say it. And so here we are, it's Monday. What is today? August
14th.
14th. And I'm out on vacation, so I'm completely discombobulated and off schedule, but delighted to be joined by Jessie Mannisto from Third Factor. And Jessie sent us a really great article that was a lot of food for thought. So we thought we'd discuss some things based on some of the concepts in there, but maybe David, would you like to start us off with Solid Ground?
Yes, thanks, Leslie. So Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice, aka woke and or COVID mandates in their workplace, university, children's school, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies, and to answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join one of our groups for only $5 per month. And to find out how to join our community, please visit solidgroundsupport.com. And please note, Solid Ground does not provide psychotherapy or legal advice, and nothing we do should be construed as such.
Excellent. Thanks, David. So Jessie, I don't know exactly how to open this with the question, because the question about questioning. So maybe, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Well, and I love that intro to Solid Ground, because we're pushing back on something, and I think that these critical social justice values raise this question for us, because they suddenly asking questions is going against a dogma, and I think that's what a lot of people are resistant to. So when you guys suggested I come chat with you, and they kindly said, well, what do I want to talk about? Okay, I suggested this article because how to be a good questioner and the importance of questioning has been close, to my heart, and why I started Third Factor, for the incorrigible questioner who just wants to have a good faith conversation, who knows how much she doesn't know, but wants to engage. And so does this through questioning. Another phrase I've heard for it is external processing. When I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, okay, that might be me. And that's just not allowed these days. And so I think the people who do that might be drawn to a place like Solid Ground. So I thought this could be a fun thing for us to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to sum it up. It's true. I think one of the things that this kind of, it's something that's, I don't know how to articulate yet, but it's something about the social justice ideology, the way that it's kind of presented. It's not really often presented as, here's this for you to consider. Let's have a discussion about it. It's more slid in kind of obliquely, like we all think like this. And so the onus is on the person who's wondering about this to ask the questions, and that creates the conflict. The question brings the conflict. And so it's very intimidating to ask questions about this stuff. And yeah, how do you approach this, and how have you seen people approach questions around these dogmas?
That's something I'm still trying to work out. One of the hardest parts is, even by marketing ourselves as a place for incorrigible questioning, Well, people were on board with that right at the very beginning, because that's baked into our cake. We're the theory of positive disintegration. I won't get into that. You can come to Third Fact if you want to know about that, but or listen to the live stream I did with Leslie. I talk about that. But I would think that would be implied, but it wasn't implied. And when I started saying, okay, but I want to talk about some of these ideas that are in critical social justice, which I wasn't as I mean, I didn't agree with it, but I wasn't like emotionally opposed to it. I just thought these seem like problems. And immediately I ran into that conflict, thinking, oh, but I'm creating this space for questioning. Oh, no. You don't question those things. And conflict immediately landed at my footsteps. So the problem that I've had, I haven't quite been able to figure out how to solve that because of the first problem. And I'm going to put this out there to see what you guys think. Anyone who opts in saying, yeah, I'm good with learning about questioning, not anyone, there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, anyone who opts into this already agrees. They buy into the value of questioning, which means they share my concerns. So I've offered people like, hey, I on my FAQ, it's like, hey, if you're like pro-critical social justice, I'll give you a free pass. Come in and talk to us about it. And so we're a little lopsided. We got into a little bit of an echo chamber. And I thought, well, we could try to be devil's advocate. Let's try to think of what their good points are. And we do that. That is one of our values. But the first question, the first hurdle is just getting people to the door who share the value of questioning, but will defend the other parts of critical social justice. That's the challenge I'm facing now, and I don't know how to solve it.
So when you say you became a little bit of an echo chamber, was it a pro CSJ echo chamber or an anti CSJ?
Anti, because I wrote about the trans issue. So of course I was persona non grata in those other circles.
That's really interesting. That sounds kind of right up your alley, Deborah, with the talking across the divide.
You should see I haven't written anything yet. I have a list of, and I'm not remembering them now, of like, okay, what are the positive things? Like what is coming out of, say, postmodernism and all these things that is something, and maybe we could solve it a different way. And so I'm regularly, I could argue about the implementation. I can argue about the interpretation, what people were having a problem with or something, but I can sometimes point to some of the problems that where do these thoughts even come from, in the first place. So I'm regularly doing that because I don't like getting lopsided. Like if I just start feeling really bitter about a particular side, I'm like, oh, and I sometimes I'll notice, I don't want to read this other opinion. And I'm like, oh, I might not, but I'll feel bad. So.
No, I think that bitterness and that rejection of it, or that hesitance to even wade in there and see it, those are things to pay attention to. Another thing I pay attention to is like, if I start to feel kind of smug about something, if I feel condescending or smug or arrogant about my opinion, then that's kind of maybe this is something I need to recheck, revisit.
I do want to bring up something in their groups because I think this is interesting. I'm not going to name anybody, but it's been bubbling up, and I just think it's interesting. Are there sometimes some things that really it's just a no? Like it's just a no, I'm not going to listen anymore, or you're just clear and you don't need to keep second guessing yourself. And maybe I'm not doing enough internal work, and like maybe, and so and people just feeling their way in that. I don't really have an answer to it, but I just think it's interesting that it's kind of coming up. Like, we might go, okay, don't kill people. I guess maybe people would say, although self-defense, right? So I don't know, but it's just an interesting thing that I'm noticing people are weighing or trying on in our groups about if there are such things that we shouldn't have our minds completely. So, that open, your mind falls out. Or my mom and I had a discussion this morning, like, should you have a position? Maybe you need to have a position to have a core sense of self. And I was like, do I need to have a position to have a core sense of self? I don't know. There's a lot of things to consider out of that.
That same phrase, I try to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brain falls out, comes up a lot in these conversations, because it's one thing to know that you don't have all the information, or to say, you know what, I've I've come to my conclusion about this. I know what my values are that led me to this conclusion. And I can explain that to you if you want. I'm probably not going to change my mind. I guess one of the questions is knowing what would change your mind, what information might reopen that after you've closed it, but also being willing to close it and say, no, I don't need to give this any more intellectual energy, because some questions will go on forever and you've got a good enough answer, even if it's not perfect. And that, I think, is an issue of, I'm into Aristotle lately. I'm just learning it. These are new toys for me. I'm not an expert, but the 4 cardinal virtues, and one is prudence, like deliberating just enough, but not so much that you get into paralysis by analysis, because that's a risk too, for especially for our type of people at Third Factor. Probably yours too.
That's really interesting. So prudence, what are the 2 sides of the prudence scale?
One is simply rushing in with your first impulse. That's the vice on one end, like not enough thinking. But the other one is a lack of capacity to act or take, executive action is the word, making a decision. And that, analysis paralysis just can never be satisfied with your decision.
Yeah, that's interesting. Jennifer, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I have so many. My mind's going down multiple avenues. First of all, I love the phrase that you used earlier about the incorrigible questioner. I was like, oh my gosh, that fits me perfectly. I always want to question things and understand more. And that's gotten me into a lot of trouble in my life, starting in childhood. But it's also brought me a lot of joy and put me in touch with other people who like to question things, and people who are just reflective, contemplative people. And I feel really grateful that I've met people like that. And yeah, I mean, I can kind of see that in myself too, because I do know in terms of the prudence and rushing in, I've seen in myself sometimes a tendency to just be absolute about something and maybe not consider everything. I think right now what I'm working with is holding my opinions, but not holding them so tightly that I'm angry that other people don't share them, even though I will admit, I think there's a lot of stupid opinions out there right now. I do. I think they're stupid, foolhardy. And if you follow them, I think it leads someplace harmful, but I don't want to be angry and bitter about that. So I'm trying to kind of like, instead of holding it like that, kind of hold things a little bit like that, and just not tighten up, and just kind of let people think what they think.
So here's a question. Sometimes people receive when you ask a question as necessarily a challenge, and other times it's just, I'm curious about why you think what you do. And especially in a written medium online, it can be really hard to tell. People will default to thinking you're challenging them or saying they're wrong. Like, don't even ask me a question. We've had that happen in Third Factor as well. Like, no, I don't even want to be questioned. Like, well, we were talking about objective truth. Does it exist? So I asked somebody, well, why don't you think objective truth exists? I'm really interested in this. This is one of my really core questions. And the person just got really angry. So, that's a tough thing to deal with. And I'm not an expert at it, but I've had some practice being like, oh, that didn't work. Don't do that. Or saying, okay, actually, that was a decision point for me. What kind of culture, what are the norms that I want to create for this space? And once people get to know each other, maybe they know a little more, like, yeah, this is a person who does ask questions from a space of genuine curiosity, but you have to then establish trust, which is a separate but related issue. Does this person want to make a fool of me, or does this person really, do I know they're my friend? Do I know why they're asking these questions?
Yeah, it seems like online, especially, there's like this presumption of bad faith is rampant. And yeah, how does one or the reactivity, right? Like the reactivity is just so strong, and you must be from that bad side that you're
Yeah.
even asking me. And, you know, either how to calm that down, or I don't know. I'm regularly thinking about how to unwind that presumption of ill motive all the time. And not that there aren't people that don't ask things because they have an ill motive, but I think it's less frequent than one might suspect.
I want to read a couple things from the chat. So Dave Porter says, perhaps authentic questioning is based on doubt. Doubt is the acid that erodes dogma. Thus, true believers are threatened by questions. And that seems to address some of what we were just discussing. I also wonder about authentic questioning based on doubt, perhaps doubt or curiosity. Those are two different motives. I wonder about what else might play into questioning. And then also S. Koval 7 says, I have no problem being closed-minded about many things, and says, I'd argue that any sustainable society needs to be extremely intolerant of many things. And then I'll just read one more here. David Moore says, it's funny that in some circles, it's not permissible to say, I don't really have an opinion about that. Some questions aren't fair in how or what they're seeking responses for.
I'm thinking about what you said, Leslie, there about I can't remember what you said now, but I remember thinking Jessie mentioned something earlier about the contrarian impulse. I was kind of interested in that as a kind of a reason as to why people go after things. Like, how do we? Is that so? Yeah. What could you tell us a bit more about that?
It's just something I've observed, especially creating a space that I do market as for incorrigible questioners, and talking about trust as well, right? When you have been let down, when nobody has been able to give you good answers, when they don't see why you're asking them and you're just brushed off, it seems to me, just from my observations, that some people have that personality trait of questioning that then doubles down in a maybe maladaptive way, where just suddenly like, no, I'm always activated. This is always triggering the time that I got brushed off or told that I was a bad person for asking these questions. And I don't trust anyone, and nobody knows how to engage me. And then maybe there's a little bit of a reason why they're then stuck in a feedback loop that alienates people because of the way they ask the question. And it can be hard to get out of, because there's a little bit of your innate personality and a little bit of your learned maybe fight or flight response. And there's a little bit of intellectual fight that comes in because you feel, like people are prepared to attack you. So yeah, that's I don't consider all incorrigible questioners to be contrarians, but they can become that, and they do.
It feels like something you get as a kind of criticism of people who maybe stand in the center. Is there's somehow people who don't stand on very much solid ground at all. There's people who just say, well, I don't really believe in anything, but I like to question everything. And I think sometimes we might even get some of that criticism from people listening to us is well, what do you guys believe then? Do you believe anything really strong and rigidly or not? And it's a difficult balance to get right, isn't it?
And I love that you mentioned that, and that your whole platform is called Solid Ground, because another problem with bringing in the questioners, that's not what the whole platform is about, right? Our platform is about this process of positive disintegration. And questioning is just a process of being in that state, but you don't want to stay there. And to the person in the chat who had commented, sometimes you do need to close your mind. Sometimes you do need to have intolerance. We endless tolerance is also a problem, right? We think of golden means, that's maybe off in one end. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do know that I'm very interested in the question. I have a guest lined up on our podcast to sort of explore this, because in the society that we live in now, our modern values, just tolerance seems like the highest virtue. But if you look at it, you scratch the surface of it, it really quickly becomes not an ultimate virtue. So why do we tolerate? Up to what point should we tolerate? Yeah, being a questioner, I find that question really interesting and important right now. I don't have answers to it.
It reflects a little bit what you were saying before about the fact that you didn't realize you were opposing sort of woke ideology just by saying, I want to be questioning, but you then found yourself opposing an ideology that says you can't question this by definition. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, I think of like James Lindsay talking about this critical social justice is like a parasite for liberalism. It's like,
Yeah, so true. Well, and I think just because it's sort of this balance, because a certain amount of openness to ideas is useful and prevents extreme rigidity, which really leads to deterioration because there's no life juice in a society or in an individual's life like that. At the same time, you still have to have your boundaries. You can't say anything goes.
Do you think, Jessie, it's just coming to me, there's sort of the sense of two different people, I'm asking you a question, you answer, you might, I don't know, whatever. And then is there a disposition of let's be sense making together? Like, we both kind of don't, like, how's it looking over there for you? And it's like looking over here like this. And you could ask somebody something, but it's not so much like you're going to be right or wrong, or like, I don't know, we're in an activity together. I don't know if there's something to that versus this like questioner.
You mean like creating a space where the purpose is to question together versus, being out in a space where that's not valued, or like?
Yeah, somehow I may be, this is completely, I'm just making this up right now. So it might be not a great thought, but I think there's one thing of like I'm just completely separate. You're over there. I'm asking you a question versus like we're doing an activity together. We're doing activity together to try to better understand like whatever the situation is going on. It might involve asking questions, but somehow it's a collaborative activity, as opposed to just not that there isn't a place to just ask a question because I have one of somebody, but I'm wondering about intentional spaces for something like that. And I don't know. I seriously don't know if that was even made sense or was a bad idea.
No, I think I get what you're going for. And it's definitely something that I've been experimenting with, trying to make a space where, okay, you want to be a questioner, opt into this sub forum, and we'll have spaces here and we'll have rules for doing it and we'll pace it. It won't be just everyone bombarding questions at people. We'll pick the topic for debates and other forms of debate is just one example. And there's different ways to do debate. But that and articles to discuss, and we'll devote time to discussing these because we're meeting a need to intellectually process and to compare notes with other people. But it's a thing that it takes a certain amount of energy. It can be fun, but just like physical exercise does also take energy and leave you drained. You're not going to be running constantly with your friends. You're going to have your running buddies, and then you're going to cool down and relax. And it's demanding, and not everyone's up for it, and not everyone enjoys it. Even the people who say they enjoy it are not constantly up for it. And so setting the rules, right? Like I was an intelligence analyst. The people there are trained in asking questions in a certain way. And then you hang out with them after work. It's not like they're still doing that. It's like, hey, I'm not in the office anymore. Leave me alone. I don't care. It's something that intentionality really makes a big difference. Now, certain type of person will need to find a place where that intentionality is welcome and addressed, I would say. Not everyone is that type of person.
It's maybe a separate discussion we could have. I'm thinking about like David Bohm had this sort of dialogue, Bohmian dialogues and emergent dialogue, which is like this very different way of like co-exploring. But that would be a separate topic.
I have read about that, and someone brought it up in our discussion about questioning. Yeah.
Dave Porter says, I found help me understand to be a way to get others to join in a cooperative conversation, like Deborah is encouraging. I know contrarians. That's interesting. Thinking back to that comment, I would accuse my brother of being like this, but then he'd probably accuse me right back because maybe it's just our dynamic. But it's that like automatic devil's advocate position. Like, do you base your position on opposition to my position? So it's more of like almost a debate for the sake of debate. And I think that can be really fun to some people sometimes. But then if it doesn't have an underpinning, like what's the purpose of this? Is it just a conversational exercise or what? And I find that there are a lot of things that I'm very curious about right now that I want to explore and want to ask questions about that I don't feel like I have an answer. I'm not rhetorically asking in order to make an argument for a position on my end. It's just an exploration because I'm really curious about how we do these things. Like one is a basis for morality. What is the basis for social morality? If we take away the structure that is created by a traditional society or by a religious doctrine, if you take that away, which is, it seems like that's where we are right now. A lot of things are back up for grabs. A lot of things are being renegotiated. So what is the basis? And I've asked this with specifically in regards to sexual morality, but you could ask it about morality more broadly. And it's not that I have some kind of a position and I'm not trying to bring people to think what I think. I'm really looking for, how can we understand this?
Man, I really want to go back to grad school and do like moral philosophy for that very reason. And again, coming back to your name, Solid Ground, and third factor's purpose for questioning, it is because it feels like the ground beneath our feet it's kind of been pulled up from under us. And these things we took for granted are being eroded. And it's like, I don't know the answer to that. I got to go back and do my homework and think about this. And so that makes me a little bit like nervous, a little like existentially anxious. And that is part of why I'm asking questions, because I don't have solid ground to stand on. And so going back to that question about the closing your mind eventually, I'd kind of like to get there where I don't have to keep asking these questions. I'd kind of like to know, like, you know what, I thought those all through and I feel comfortable now. I do have a solid ground to stand on. I know why I value what I value, and I'll reopen it if something pressing really comes up. But I think that this is the state of our society right now, especially for people who are drawn to these sort of questions. So maybe I'll go back to grad school. If anyone out there wants to like offer me a scholarship, just get in touch and I'll, I really want to do it. We'll see what happens, but it's so important right now. I think, I'm sure others listening will agree.
There's a commenter in the chat. I can't tell if this is frustration with us or frustration more broadly, but Swiss Chalet says, make a space, safe spaces. Oh, come on. So I think that's a little bit of a comment about what we were talking about, but then also says, listening to liberals talk for more than 5 minutes, I'm reminded how they think. It's so far removed from reality. Wow. And I'm curious, is that a reflection on this conversation, or is this a reflection on something else? I'd really like to understand that a little bit better. Yeah, that's interesting. Intolerance of over tolerance sounds like a good slogan for a woke resistance t-shirt. That's from Jay Bourne.
I'm thinking about, again, so many people feeling like this lack of ground or whatever. And then that thing my mom said today about having a core, and it just makes me wonder about, I need to be doing my meditation practice more, like what should our core rest on, or in changing times with all the stuff where we may not figure out where do we stand on certain, or all of it, or whatever, like, what do we do? Like in the meantime, like, how much of it, is it, you talked about values, Jessie, or like, what are things that one might anchor around? If you say you don't have a particular religious tradition or something like that, and you don't quite know how you're reading the world anymore, you're not sure. I don't have to answer that particularly, but it just seems like a time where a lot of people are probably, whoa, the things, and is there somewhere to rest when the mental part isn't all figured out, or the orientation isn't quite there the way it used to be?
I want to bring up a young person who is in our group at Third Factor, and who I've seen this in other young people too, but this is the young woman I talk to the most, who it's interesting the way she is trying to articulate what I think are her values, but she's always caveats it with trying to be kind. Those people also deserve friends. I want to be tolerant of them. There's so many caveats, right? And I want to say to her, and maybe this speaks to the commenter, like, oh, this is how liberals think. I want to say, like, you can just, it's not up to you. It's not required for you to say that person deserves a friend. Maybe that person is behaving badly and needs to behave better, and then that person will have friends. Maybe that's a tough lesson that some people need to learn, and we have tolerated too much in that respect. I think back to, the idea that you will be ostracized from your group if you don't share certain norms, it goes back before woke times. I was part of a little group that really didn't date very much in the early 2000s because we just didn't like the dating culture. So we're like, all right, I guess I'm going to be single. But you couldn't criticize the dating culture, the hookup culture, because then you were, people wouldn't like you. You're just like, well, I guess it's just not good for me. And now that I'm older and I'm married and I'm figured out more of my values, I could say on behalf of a younger person, I hear that people are struggling with this culture, and more people are saying that now. But it was interesting. Like back when I was in my early 20s, I wouldn't have said that because we didn't say canceled then, but oh gosh, I don't want to pass judgment on other people. I don't want to be intolerant, because again, intolerance is just the worst thing you can manifest under our current value system. And maybe that's what's breaking down. I see that criticism. If that's what we're saying, that liberals do too much, I understand that point.
What are the areas where we're specifically supposed to exercise tolerance and not question? Does it all come back to that, the lifestyle stuff? Is it sexual morality again? Is that kind of the bush that we're beating around?
That's a good
Deborah,
question.
I'm sorry. Yes.
I went to a bad place.
Well, okay, let me throw another one out. Economics, right?
Economics. Jennifer.
I haven't watched your previous questions, your live streams on this, but I really want to. So maybe you've hashed this out already. Maybe I'm stepping on
A little bit.
well-trodden ground. So my bad for doing that. But like economics, right? But it's okay to be a socialist now, and people are fighting about that. But you're allowed to say that now. It was seen as weirder before the Bernie campaign. So, but that's coming from the left with its institutional power. So you can say that. And people are coming back and saying, you know what, maybe if you've called yourself a communist, maybe that's a lapse in judgment. Maybe we are going to venture to say that. And I've seen that going around on Twitter a bit. And I think that's, another area that is what should we tolerate? What should we tolerate is a question.
So economics, more specifically regarding like affirmative action, reparations, social support for the homeless. What are the kind of the key topics that flare people up?
Criminal justice.
Criminal justice.
I'm even thinking like who gets to own the creation, like how should wealth be distributed and who gets to control these sorts of things. And I do have lefty ideas that way, but I understand now why some of these things don't work out. I know less about economics than I do about philosophy, but it's an interesting question. What the Overton window on that subject.
David, do you have any thoughts on that?
Do you know what? I'm still stuck on the sexual morality question a little bit. My brain's still there. I had a conversation with this was a while ago, but it was at a dinner party where we had a sort of strident vegan at the dinner, and he made a pretty wild claim that it's almost just, we could imagine a world in which instead of eating animals, we had sex with animals, and he was kind of making this. Jen's just on the spit take. I said, where is this thinking come from? And he said that he read an article that he then sent to me, which I read a little bit of whilst I was at the dinner table, because I thought this is the weirdest conversation of all time. But this guy was making a point, and I think this is what I was thinking about a little bit, was that he was saying that the reason we eat animals rather than have sex with them is, in his words, arbitrary. And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean arbitrary? And he just gave me a dictionary definition of the word arbitrary. And then he moved on to something else. I was like, what the fuck do you mean? Like, so, sorry, you wonder why I'm bringing this up, but it comes back to this idea that, like, if you engage in debate with people who literally have no interest, no understanding of the foundations of social, cultural, biological, like history or whatever, they will literally look at the world and think maybe everything is up for grabs. We are infinitely socially malleable. And it's like, I don't know, like, I was just thinking that as you were talking, Leslie, about sort of sexual morality, and just thinking like, I know a lot of people that use this arbitrary understanding of the world as like, it happens to be this way, but there's no reason why the next generation of people couldn't have a completely different world. And you kind of feel like saying, all right, well, there'll be suffering and death and all sorts of accidents if every generation, everyone has to learn things afresh every single time. Yeah, anyway, those are some thoughts.
That's really interesting. It is really interesting. Like, what is it all based on, and is it all completely malleable?
Right.
In the chat, I had asked Swiss Chalet to say more about what the beef was about us and this conversation, and he or she responds, "I can't see a single person here lasting more than 2 days out in the wild. The oversensitivity, the second guessing about everything, it's painful to watch. The lack of mental fortitude is palpable." And then goes on to say, "When I say out in the wild, I mean outside the academic, government, corporate, team building world." And and then says, "Oh, you're also good at overanalyzing everything. What is tolerant?" I just want to say, it is, in most of the time when you start a conversation like this, you start on this broad conceptual level, and it takes a while before you start getting down into things that are a little bit more specific. And that's kind of where I feel like the conversation usually takes a turn towards the more concrete. And that's what's happening in the example that David's giving. If you are really annoyed with us, I just would like to invite you to go watch some other show so we can have our conversation. So thank you for your feedback, but that's a little bit intense. So if you really don't like it, there are lots of other things you can go be entertained by.
They want to
yourself.
Like it. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
go on, Deborah.
I was gonna say, or reveal yourself and come on and let us see you. I don't know if that Leslie gets to invite, so that's not my thing. But
no, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. I don't know. It just seems like we're back to that contrarian attitude, but
yeah, it sounds like a contrarian impulse, doesn't it? Someone wants to be here. I mean, how many times do you see that in YouTube comment sections? People are there going, "This is completely wrong, and here's the reasons why," and you think, okay.
Well, you know what? It's really actually kind of a gift to this conversation because it illustrates one of the points that we're discussing. So it is, I mean, people can question, people can doubt, and people can have an opinion, and there are ways to do that, and there are ways to engage with that. So I guess it just plays right into the exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. I take the criticism, but it's like I've adapted to that world. That is the world I was prepared for and that I'm raised in, but I see the flaws with it. So to that extent that there's a little bit of useful criticism in there, fair enough. I probably wouldn't survive out in the wild. But I'm trying, by analyzing these and figuring out what I really believe and what I've been afraid to say and why. I think that's the way to build that confidence, and better late than never, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's also like there are places and times when you have certain discussions. There's just the ability, it's something set aside. It's like a little treat for the mind to be able to sort of play through certain questions and philosophical attitudes. So it's not really in the real world when you're doing that. It's set aside. I don't know, David, you were about to say something, I think.
I was just wondering, Jessie, like, do you feel like you've always been someone who's asked questions? Were you always someone at school thinking, hang on a minute, I'm not sure I buy this, I'm going to challenge the teacher? Or is it something that's developed, or is it something you've learned a bit more?
That's a really interesting question. No one's ever asked me that before, because I think they just take me as the questioner, but I haven't always done it. I always was curious, but I was a lot more just earnestly trusting the authority figures when I was younger, who were, again, liberal, giving me these values, and they seemed fair. And that's the thing, right? The kid who is a good student gets the A. It's because you regurgitate what you're taught. It's not because you ask the good questions until you get to college. And then the right professor, not all professors, but I was lucky enough to have a few who did. I still like a really strong memory for me is when a professor whose class I really enjoyed signaled to me after class, that was really good, where you asked that edgy question, like one of those growth moments. And I knew that I really enjoyed doing that, and that I wanted to do it more, and that I wasn't doing it because it wasn't ever encouraged. It wasn't discouraged, but it wasn't the rut that we were taught in school. And so thinking about that in like grad school, by that point, this was grad school, I wanted to do it more. And I recognized that I hadn't been doing it, even as much as I liked intellectual exploration.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm finding myself, I'm on a course at the minute where we sort of, it feels like we're getting mixed messages, encouraged to ask questions as sort of psychology trainees, to ask questions, to not take anything for granted, to always be open into inquiry. And at the same time, there really are certain things we're not there to talk about. There are facilitators that come 2 by 2 sometimes because they want to protect against too much asking questions on particular topics. And it's kind of, it's a double bind.
And that's interesting. When I talk about grad school, this was 2010, right? So this was now 13 years ago. This was before really critical social justice had taken over. It was in some places. This was University of Michigan campus. So it was there in 2010, but it wasn't everywhere. And this was a class where we were talking about game theory. That was a different mindset than people who are in that sort of space. And what's really made me feel extra uncomfortable, it's clear. This is why I take the listeners' criticism. Like, this came out of being nervous. They came out of fear. But fear that led me to be like, it's time for me to grow a spine because I'm seeing more people like that. I didn't see that back then. And that has definitely made me say, you know what? This is the hill I will die on, questioning. But it costs something. It absolutely costs something.
Good for you.
Well, now I want to ask you guys, and maybe starting with you, David, like, had you felt like this tension was new to you, or did you always feel like you could ask questions before? Did you like asking questions? Like, what are other people's experiences?
I definitely felt a really big sort of friction between pissing the teacher off maybe sometimes and not, or in my mind pissing them off. Obviously it probably wasn't quite like that, but in my mind I wanted to just go through and do everything I needed to get the A's, or in my case B's maybe. But like, I think I had that alongside this sort of being on the cusp of, it's like almost like a cognitive, I think Leslie said something like a feast for the mind earlier. I felt like you sometimes have this moment where you're just like, oh, I'm on the edge of something. There's almost like a little moment where I could leapfrog up and kind of like improve my thinking on something if I could just answer this question in the moment and gain a better understanding. That's one way to look at it. But then there's also what I've been facing on the course more recently, which is really standing, I guess, I wouldn't say standing up. I would just say asking questions of some of the things that I'm hearing. But the problem is with these things, as we all know, is you ask a question of something and you immediately get put in the opposite group. You're asking a question of a collectivist idea. You're an individualist. You must be right wing if you're asking questions of left wing ideology. So I've never come across sort of such a politically a politically heightened course before. I've never seen this before. It feels quite new in some ways to me, but I don't know what other people's experiences are.
That's really interesting that you just said that, David. I was thinking it might be interesting to do a conversation on the rhetorical fallacies of the woke, because what you're describing right there is that immediately when you ask a question, there's a break in the logic because there's an ad hominem sort of, false teaming attack that is placed on you. Nobody's going to address your question. They're just going to talk around it and talk about you and what kind of person it makes you that you would ask. So we'd almost fill, an entire hour just discussing their rhetorical fallacies alone.
That's a really good idea. I'd like to do that. And that's that's such a problem with us curious-minded people, because we're not always trying to just defeat the person we're speaking to. We're trying to really build on our own understanding. And you can ask questions about yourself. You can ask questions about the person who's speaking, even though you might have a huge amount in common with them or not. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, as soon as you ask these questions, you're put into that camp, and it becomes an ad hominem attack, like you say.
All right, now I have a question that made me think of why don't people adopt that? Because we're saying this is a trait, or maybe the implication is like, oh, smart people do that. So you're saying you're smart, whatever. But anyone can take this as a value and a habit that they think is valuable and should be culturally protected. Anyone can say, okay, I'm going to ask questions too, but people don't. And the obvious reason is because there's not a reward for it. They'll get in trouble. But is there more to it than that? Like, why don't people just say, hey, that seems like a good idea, I'm going to do it too?
I think, David, we talked about this. I've often remember somebody else recently, but there was this, like, what are people, you talk about values, right? And like, there could be someone for whom harmony, like that's not one of my top ones, right? It's just so foundational that curiosity, it trumps curiosity, and so I think it might just be how different, and that could be from childhood circumstances. Maybe people fight, who knows? They could have just born that way. So that's one possibility where just like the harmony thing or non-conflict is just way higher than being curious.
Yeah, and there's a difference. One of the big 5 temperamental characteristics is openness. And so some people are going to find themselves more curious about concepts and ideas, and some people are less curious about concepts and ideas. I've talked with somebody about this recently. I don't remember where I was talking about this with someone, but there was a person I spoke to a while back who rated low in openness when they did their big 5 analysis, and felt like that's an area where we judge people. The culture at large claims to value openness to such an extent that people who are less open, it's like it's a deficit in openness. So I think that there should be a different way to frame that, because it's probably a preference for something like you said, harmony, Deborah, or structure, or some other thing like a certainty, a comfort. There's probably a better way to discuss that in terms of having a lot of, or having not enough of, or less of a thing.
I do think a lot of it, is temperamental, and some of it is sort of instinctual to get along with your herd for the purposes of survival. And I also think that right now what we're seeing is an attempt at a massive power grab. So there are people that are incentivized to shut down any questioning. When you have these DEI trainers that absolutely annihilate anybody who asks a question, even if they're just asking for the purposes of clarification. It could be somebody who actually subscribes to a lot of these notions. But if they ask a question, it's very Maoist in its spirit, in that it's like, we've got to shut this down because this could lead to questioning the authority of, these woke ideas. And the same thing is happening in colleges and universities. And it's also, I think there's a really big mob mentality going on, because I've known of cases where somebody questions something in a classroom or says, oh, well, I see your point about this, but I think about this a bit differently. And maybe they're questioning these ideas of white privilege or any of the other sacred cows that we have right now. And they are absolutely bullied and ostracized. And I see a lot of that as a power play by the people that are doing the bullying and the ostracization, because they're saying, see, I'm one of the good ones. I'm not a racist. And you could tell that by the fact that I'm going after this person who dared to ask this question. And so some of it I see as an abusive authoritarian use of power.
And it's interesting that it cloaks itself in the value of openness. Very Orwellian.
Everything that is harmful, or if you want to say evil, always cloaks itself in the disguise of the good. Always. If you're going after a group of people, well, it's because that group of people is dangerous, and we're trying to restore safety, and we're trying to protect ourselves from these people. It's always been that way. And that's the way that I think it is now with proponents of these, authoritarian ideas, that everybody has to think a certain way or else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and coming back to the idea of the sexuality stuff, which is at the core of a lot of this, the alphabet gang and the never-ending embracing of kink and all the things, and the the going on towards the stuff that's being presented in these pride events and things to children. And so there's this idea that that represents openness, but I think that it could be more accurately looked at as representing change. It's not openness, it's just something different. But it's being cloaked as openness. If it were really openness, there would still be openness towards traditional relationship
That's right.
values.
So progress.
Yes. And there'd be openness towards people who say, hey, I don't quite believe that a person can switch their genders. I don't adhere to those ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're really open, they'd be open towards that. So I don't see the sort of ultra left as being open anymore. Perhaps at a time, yes, I see them as being very authoritarian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about these ideas. I think all of these things are right, and just different blends of, in different people and different cultures. There is just like the person who appreciates harmony and who is, a culture that valorizes that or values that as part of their culture. Like when I spent some time teaching in Japan, and they're, of course, one of these cultures that really prioritizes harmony. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down is a saying in Japanese culture. But there was one teacher, because they have the same, diversity of temperaments in the Japanese population, or I don't know if the distribution is the same, but there is variation. And this teacher had like an American spirit in her temperament, and she just loved. She's like, you're going to come in there and you're going to make these kids explore and ask questions. That's your job as the American teacher. And because she just wish that her culture was like that, but it's not. She lives in Japan, and there it's easier to have that harmony, that love of harmony. And that maybe if you're in conservative spaces and you have values that you trust and they are working for you in your judgment, then that's and you're not facing, of course they're laughing at us with our tolerance of the alphabet soup and all of this stuff, because I share those concerns. This seems to be people who are using the spirit of tolerance to ask us to tolerate things that there are reasons that we haven't in the past tolerated those things. And that's the space that if you're open to tolerance and you're valorizing openness, you're going to have to deal with. And so I find that interesting. Those are very different things. Harmony as a temperament versus authoritarianism, which is very unharmonious. I mean, is it? It's like coercive harmony. Yeah, right. Yeah. It's a very different type of person.
Faux harmony.
Do authoritarians would they ever self-identify as authoritarian? It always sounds like it's a complete blind spot for people to realize that they are being authoritarian. It's always people who do things for compassion and for safety and come from it of like, oh, we're being tolerant. No, not really, because what you're always doing, your ideology is always steeped in some like fighting back against a systemic oppression or societal malpractice or something like that. It's always against that. It's always a revolution. But I just don't, I don't know, just a thought. I was thinking like nobody identifies as authoritarian because most people seem to really completely have their, what do you say? I mean, Deborah, you talked about this, like shadows not being integrated properly.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I can think of one exception because I've been studying the Russian Revolution, and it seems like Lenin was really into the dictatorship of the proletariat. That came out of Marx, and he really embraced it. He's like, nope, dictatorship. We're totally doing that. Yes, that's the way to do it. Right. So and then that became a thing that some people decided was a good idea. Terror is cool. Let's just do that. I'm making fun of that. I don't cut that out and have me saying that. I'm against terror. The internet, you never know what people are going to do.
It's good that you've only got like one example. There was this guy Lenin. That didn't go so well.
I'll tell you an example from my own life of when I was an authoritarian. I don't know if I've talked about this before. It's kind of a funny and kind of an embarrassing example. I was as a young mom, this was my daughter Savannah. She's now 27, so she would have been like 3 maybe. So I was like 22, And she had this little bike that she really liked. And she had been practicing riding on it, and then she fell off of it and she was terrified of it. She was like, I'm not getting back on that thing. And I, day after day, would take her out and try to get her to ride this bike. And this one day she threw a little tantrum about it. And this is like one of my really bad mommy stories. I put her on the bike and I rode her around the cul-de-sac with my hands over her hands so that she's riding in this bike. And I said, you're going to ride it and you're going to like it. There's my authoritarian
Two people,
story.
Lenin and Leslie.
Ellie, there you go.
Yeah, there it is.
I think you're raising a good point, Leslie, which is that we've all got authoritarian natures within us, right?
And where is the line of like, because I'm seeing there's going to probably be a comeback of a bit strong. Someone said you need to parent a little harder. I was listening to some podcast today, not this sort of like snowplow or like helicopter, whatever. And so I don't know, there might be like, you know what, I have a client who just had this dad always used to say, like, make it work. He'd throw them into situations and be like, you're doing this, and it's one thing if it's, totally dangerous, past age appropriate, the kid's screaming bloody murder, you know what I mean? It's another one. It's just like, you're riding. I don't know about making him say you're gonna like it, but I could see going like, you're on this bike, we are doing this right now, we're doing this.
Parenting
it has to be authoritarian. It might be just fine.
The finisher says pushing kids to be more is not wicked. I agree with that completely. I totally agree. My example is just that I lost my temper with a 3-year-old, and I said something that on reflection was like, wow, you're going to write it and you're going to like it. Where did that come from?
Like parents passing on wisdom is like, that's a core foundational relationship in our society, but it's unique to the parent-child relationship, or maybe not entirely unique, but adults are not operating that way between each other for the most part. Maybe there's a master and a student. So I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that.
And
do you
also
have kids, Jessie?
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have kids yet?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is interesting trying to balance that. That's a whole conversation in and of itself. How much to push and how much to expect and how much to scaffold. But we're all products of parenting, so we probably all have opinions, whether whatever end of it we're on.
The passing down of wisdom is, that really interests me, and the way the internet and young people have always, it's good for young people to be with other young people, but I wonder now how much, with the ability to just constantly be connected to other young people, and if you feel at all like you're different, you can find other young people who share that sense of difference, and how that is just completely disrupting the handing down of wisdom from generation to generation. So each group, each cohort does have to reinvent its values, because there's actually been a technological disruption.
Probably one that means that parents are now saying, I don't understand this new modern world. So who's gonna be my who's gonna be the person that I sort of defer to for wisdom, because I don't feel confident in it, maybe.
No, that's a really good point. I think parents are outsourcing their own authority quite a bit and being undermined quite a bit. So,
Oh yeah.
Well, what's a final thought? Anybody have a final thought to wrap up on?
My final thought is I've been highly distracted by the adamant vegan, and I ate bacon yesterday morning for breakfast. I really loved it, And so I'm now sitting here contemplating what is the difference between me eating this pig and having sex with the pig. So I'm trying to formulate very clear thoughts about this. It seems quite different to me at first glance.
If you want a bit more on that, like the guy that was advocating it was sort of saying, he's like, look, I mean, if anything, it's not about what happens to the animal. Like a sheep will think, you know, in a way, a sheep would probably prefer you do the other thing rather than eat it, because, you know, it's life's not going to. And I'm like, so the morality is purely about how much you do to the animal. There's no like social norms. There's no biological. I always think to myself, like, do I even go into this? Do I even start saying, okay, what does it say about you as a person in society that you do that to an animal? Is that not? But then I thought, there's no point. This person's clearly lost their mind, but they've just gone into this sort of strange woke postmodern world where everything's up for grabs. But
the question is,
article with you, Jen, if you're interested.
If I was a farmer, I would not leave him alone with any of the animals. Let's just say that.
It's a vegan without a very integrated shadow. That's probably
yes.
he's just like, I got to stay away from animals altogether. Just altogether. Hard stop. Well, excellent. Thank you so much for a great discussion today. We'll leave it with the deviant vegan person.
And that.
Yeah.
It's just a D vegan.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jessie. It's been really great having you in the conversation.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I hope you join us again in the future sometime.
My pleasure.
All right.